All right, hello and welcome to everyone to today's webinar on burnout, where we're going to be looking at a functional medicine approach to burnout and how we use functional medicine as part of a burnout recovery process to get someone back to energy, vitality, creativity, productivity, all those sorts of things. I'm Dr. Michael Hobbs. You can just call me Mickey, and I'll be taking us through the content today. We'll be going for about an hour. I want to leave plenty of time for questions at the end. So I'll present a little bit and then open it up to questions. However, if you do need to slow me down as we go, please do so. I do tend to talk quite quickly and I do have a lot that I want to cover today. And I am assuming that you do have a basic level of health literacy because, quite honestly, a lot of my clients do. Usually they come to me because they've already been in the merry-go-round of mainstream medicine for a while, and either they're not being heard. Unfortunately, that's all too common, particularly for fatigue syndromes like burnout, and that is unfortunately even more true for marginalized people and for women, who is a lot of the people who are affected by burnout for systemic issues, systemic reasons, and structural reasons. Are more at risk to burnout. Or they come to me because they're not seeing results with mainstream medicine, or they don't just want to be covering up symptoms, but they want to get to the root causes. Or they know the strategies and the things that they need to implement. However, they need some help in doing that and managing that. And that's where I think health coaching comes in a really magical way, because we actually work with you to implement those strategies in a way that is sustainable so that you can actually get from A to B in a successful way. So let's dive in. Before we begin, I do just want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land where I was raised, which is Sydney, Australia, which is Gadigal country. And I pay my respects to Aboriginal elders, past, present, and future, and emerging, not only to Indigenous Australians, but also Torres Strait Islander groups, and also just Indigenous communities around the world. I also pay my respects to the lineages of Portugal, where I now reside, in Lisbon, in Portugal. And I do also just want to center that this is a safe and inclusive space for people of all gender and sexuality identities, including trans people, including non-binary people, including asexual and intersex people as well. So in today's webinar, we're going to obviously be talking about burnout, and we'll be looking a little bit into the definitions, the causes, the symptoms, the root causes and risk factors. And then today we're specifically honing in on the physical aspects of burnout. So how burnout plays out in the body. And we'll be looking at things like cortisol and adrenal fatigue, nutritional, hormonal, and nervous system support, and then how to choose a practitioner to work with. Now, obviously, burnout affects us uh, holistically. It affects both body and mind. However, when we're looking at burnout and when we're talking around how it's going to address burnout, I have a paradigm where we start with the body. And there's a few reasons for this. But it is very hard to jump into CBT or understanding your story and your emotions and building your career plan and your 5-year goal if you are strung out and your body needs rest, if you're basically in a state of chronic anxiety. First thing we need to do is to address the needs of the body, help the body find safety, help the body regulate itself, help the body restore its energy and any other things that are going on there in terms of hormonal dysregulation, GIT dysregulation. And then we can start looking at the emotional, the mental, the relational aspects from there. Now, this is just one model I'm presenting here. Obviously, burnout is much more complex than this, and it is both linear and non-linear in terms of a healing journey from burnout. On one hand, it is linear. We have this linear relationship with time. We're going forwards, we're aging. And at the same time, recovering from burnout is often non-linear. And it's often, I like to say, spiral-like in that people can get flare-ups down the line. However, it's not to say that they're back at square one. Often they have something that crops up in their life further down the line, which flares up or is a trigger for previous burnout symptoms. But because they don't want to go into full burnout mode, they're able to see it and address it and make the change more quickly. And that is one of the gifts of burnout. Also, too, obviously, burnout for most people takes a lot longer than 6 weeks. Once physical symptoms develop for burnout, really, you're looking at a minimum 12 weeks or 3 months recovery process. And it can take up to many years, to be honest, to fully recover from burnout. However, I do think that this is a useful scaffold just to help give you some clarity around how we work through burnout recovery and where we're going to begin. What we're going to be talking about today is we're going to be talking largely about the body, is these first couple of weeks. So specifically these first 3 weeks. And this is where functional medicine really plays a role. And then, it also plays a role further down the line for retesting to see if there have been improvements. But it really plays a role in these early phases to really take a look at what's going on in the body and what we need to address that. A bit about me. I am a health and leadership coach, chiropractor, and functional medicine practitioner. I've been doing this for over 10 years. I've worked in numerous clinical research and business roles, both within private practice, corporate, and digital health and fitness sectors. I have also personally experienced burnout, and I won't go too much into my personal journey with burnout today. I have a podcast where you can go listen to where I share some of my reflections on that. But all that to say that for me and what I find for most of my clients as well is burnout. My burnout was multifaceted. It was layered. It was complex. There were multiple reasons which led to my burnout, which led to me being burnt out. And also, the recovery process had to be multifaceted and it had to be addressed at multiple levels as well. Now, in my case, it was both physical and emotional, and also spiritual or at the soul level, however you want to word that, that I needed to look at things. Specifically, physically, I dealt with a lot of fatigue, but also with a lot of gastrointestinal issues, specifically acute parasites. And I was vomiting many mornings on my way to work, all these sorts of things. Even though I was quite highly functional, I was still overdoing my capacity or what my capacity was. But that sort of set me on a path of really diving into specifically gut health and gastrointestinal health and helping people with parasites, which has sort of what led me down the road of functional medicine in the first place. I am also a dancer, writer, and performance artist. I currently live in Lisbon, Portugal. On the right here is my beautiful, gorgeous clinic back in Sydney. I've had two clinics. I've had a running coaching company. We used to have an app for this. This is me at university giving the valedictorian speech. All that to say, I'm a massive nerd. I did very well in my master's, got a lot of scholarships, and published some research, all these sorts of things. But just to say, I'm a big nerd, so I'm looking forward to nerd out with you for the next 50 minutes or so. Here's me preparing for my first ultra marathon. I used to do a lot of running. I now have moved more into dance. I spend about 3 to 4 hours a day at the dance studio, sometimes up to 6 hours a day. So I do a lot of dance. And this is me in New York, bottom right, waiting for our marathon team. I was the medical director for a marathon team for a while, and this is the year we took 106 athletes to New York to do the New York Marathon. And it was an amazing achievement. So proud of all of those athletes. And all this to say, I bring a wealth of experience, both personally and professionally, both from within healthcare and looking at disorders and disease processes, but also working with a lot of performance, both athletic performance, but also business performance in terms of working with CEOs and those sorts of things as well. So let's dive into the nitty-gritty. What is burnout? Well, If you're here, you probably have some sense of what that means to you. But we do have a definition of burnout, and burnout is defined as a chronic state of exhaustion plus cynicism plus reduced efficacy and or productivity. In other words, it is both a physical and a mental condition, and it's characterized primarily physically by a fatigue state. It's a chronic state of fatigue. It's a fatigue syndrome. With that, there are also emotional effects, specifically the cynicism here, which shows up as disillusionment, but it can also show up in other ways in terms of increased, decreased emotionality, detaching from people, depersonalizing, procrastinating, avoiding people, or just sort of a what's the point attitude. And all this can lead to a reduction in efficacy and or productivity and also just joy in living and all these sorts of things. A lot of this definition comes from a workplace context. However, burnout also occurs amongst students. I've seen it in school-age students, university students. It also occurs at home amongst carers. It can occur in many contexts. It doesn't have to be workplace only. And there are many ways burnout can show up in terms of symptoms and symptomatology. As I said, it's important to recognize, I'm going to keep reiterating this, that burnout is both a physical and a mental health condition. And we need to be looking at how we can support both the body and the mind in this. Of course, failure of language, those two things are not separate. Body and mind are in constant communication. They inform one another. They're part of the same ecosystem. But in terms of the way that we think about the body in the West and in the global North, then it's important to recognize that we're going to treat burnout by treating both the body and also treating psychologically as well. I'm just going to point to a few of the less common symptoms here of burnout. Obviously, we have fatigue, but we also have things like the inability to feel joy or pleasure, or losing interest in hobbies, or losing interest in spending time with friends and loved ones. And obviously, this can lead down the road to also other depressive disorders like major depressive disorder. And these conditions often coexist and can be comorbidities for one another and may even be risk factors for one another. So it's important to recognize that. Then we have the other physical symptoms of burnout, things like pain, headaches, muscle problems. I have two friends who experienced burnout and they realized it was an issue when one day they woke up and couldn't lift up their arms. It does play out in the musculoskeletal system this way. Gut issues are another huge one, specifically reflux and IBS, and that can be both IBS-D, C, or M. In other words, IBS with a predominance for either diarrhea or constipation, or a mixed profile of both diarrhea and constipation. And then we have other things like fluid retention and swelling, recurrent infections, sex hormone changes and sexual dysfunction, and salt cravings. And these all largely point to adrenal fatigue. The adrenals are two glands that sit above your kidneys and are really important for producing cortisol, which is part of our stress response, but is also really helpful for us. It's a natural part of getting out of bed in the morning. I'll talk a little bit about this a bit later, and the importance of cortisol. But the adrenal glands also do other things such as produce mineralocorticoids, which are really important for fluid balance, and also produce hormones that are really important for directly affect our sexual hormones, because whilst most of our sex hormones are produced in our gonads, they're not all produced in our gonads. Actually, our adrenal glands also produce our sex hormones like testosterone and estrogen and these sorts of things, and what as well, or the precursors for those hormones. And therefore, people with burnout often can present with erectile dysfunction, hair loss, changes to periods, um, dysmenorrhea, which is period pain. They can also present with salt cravings, particularly when people are in extreme burnout. Because of the effects on these glands, it basically puts the body in a chronic state of dehydration, which means that your body is craving salt because salt helps us hold on to water. So it affects our fluid balance. Some very unfun facts about burnout here. It's very common. It's really common amongst office workers, people who have office jobs. It's very expensive, not just to the employer, although your employer should realize that statistics say it costs about 2 times an annual wage to replace someone in terms of loss of productivity and training and all these sorts of things. So, they should also be invested in helping you recover from your burnout. But it also costs us as individuals if we are suffering from burnout too. I know places like Holland have introduced burnout leave, but my understanding is it still falls under normal sick leave. Or it might be slightly separate. I'm not fully across it yet. Great if you live there, but even if you do live there, it's still you only have a certain amount of leave that you can use towards it. And unfortunately, there is still a lot of stigma towards burnout, a lot of questions, even amongst the medical community around does it even really exist? How do we define it properly? How do we test for it? And with this, you can sometimes get some employers and things, and even doctors, not taking it seriously. If you are suffering burnout, my advice to you would be to address it as early as you can, because it's only going to get harder to address the longer you wait. The longer you stay in that hole, the harder it gets to climb out and also the more costly it can get to you. So do it while you are resourced to do so financially, but also from a time point of view and also energetically, because it can only get harder a lot of the time, unfortunately. Um, One more thing I'll say about this is that burnout affects women more and also marginalized communities. And again, this is not a sign of weakness amongst these groups, but again, points to structural inequalities that still sadly exist within our society. Just a few misconceptions. We're going to fly through these. As I said, burnout doesn't just happen at work. It can happen at school, at home, in community, and it should always be considered contextually. And this leads into my second point. But I don't want to either normalize nor pathologize burnout. And what I mean by that is it's not normal. We should not normalize burnout to be a normal part of work. There is a way we could go to work and set up systems of work where we're not burning ourselves out. And at the same time, I don't want to pathologize burnout either, because burnout is not a pathology. In many ways, it's a natural response to an unsupportive environment, or it's just at this very basic definition in injury, quote unquote, to the body, which means that the stress has overdone our capacity to recover over a chronic time frame. But this contextual piece is really, 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 really critically important. Burnout is not a sign of weakness, and it is the shared responsibility of the individual, their network, friends, families, me if they want to see me, and the society at large and their employer to all help recover from burnout and build a context and an environment where we are not setting ourselves up to fail, which unfortunately, with the way work is going, with the way that unaffordability is going in a lot of the world, and the way that environmental degradation is going in a lot of the world, and the systemic effects this has on our health, unfortunately, it's getting harder and harder to be well, and we are making it easier and easier for ourselves to burn out. Having said that, once you have burnt out, you're not more likely to burn out again. You will probably be more sensitive to triggers if they crop up in the future. There's something that happens when we become particularly sensitive. We learn our lesson, basically. We don't want to go back to being fully burnt out. So when we sense triggers propping up in the future, what we do, if we do the work now to address them, we don't want to go back there. It feels really horrible to even get a taster of what that's like again. And so actually, for myself and for many of my clients, by doing the work now, really addressing the root causes of burnout and taking the steps that need to be changed, life actually gets better than you ever imagined because you've actually realigned your life with what is meaningful to you and what gives you purpose and vitality and energy and supports you rather than takes from you. So if you've recovered from burnout well, there's nothing to suggest that you're going to burn out again. Okay, there are a number of workplace risk factors here that I'm not going to spend too much time on. We're going to do a whole separate webinar on the workplace. But all this to say that there is good evidence, good research pointing to a number of risk factors within a workplace that do predispose someone to burning out. I do just want to draw our attention to a few. We're humans, we're complex, we have paradoxical needs in a sense. We need safety, we also need growth. We need support, we also need autonomy. We need community, we also need individuality. Um, and this shows up in the workplace too. And specifically when we work in a workplace where we feel unsupported or our values aren't aligned, or there is either a lack of growth or a lack of autonomy or community or recognition or any of these things, we're more likely to burn out. As an aside, we're also more likely to develop other conditions, including mental health conditions, and including physical health conditions. Low back pain has been associated with these risk factors as well. And I've had more than one client as a chiropractor that I was working with where we had to address some of these workplace risk factors, and those clients had to have difficult conversations with their employers. And that was the most successful strategy for helping eliminate their back pain. So, what is the role of functional medicine? I mean, that's what we're all here for today, right? So, let's dive into it a little bit. So, functional medicine is one approach to medicine where we really obsess over why. We really, really, really obsess over looking for the root causes of things, going upstream as much as we can. We're not so interested in just managing symptoms. We want to know why you have developed those symptoms in the first place. Because just because you have a hereditary history for something or genetic history for something, doesn't mean that those genes will be expressed. And for example, blood pressure. If you have high blood pressure, why do you have high blood pressure? Rather than just give you medications for high blood pressure, a functional medicine practitioner really goes, why do you have blood pressure? And if we go upstream enough, what we find the majority of the time is it's because of A plus B plus C plus D plus E plus F, which has created the perfect environment or created this environment for high blood pressure to then manifest in the body. And that could look like family history. It could look like eating the wrong foods. It could look like your sleep-wake cycle is out of whack. It could look like you're perimenopausal or menopausal, or you have low estrogen, or it could look like a side effect of taking oral estrogen. It could look like, obviously, chronic stress. That will elevate your blood pressure. What's your mental health doing? Do you have anxiety? What's your relationship to stress? Good stress and bad stress. There's a difference between eustress, which is functional good stress, and distress, which is harmful on the body. What's your liver doing? What's your kidney doing? What's your brain doing? What's your blood doing? What's your heart doing? What are these organs doing to communicate? How well are they communicating with one another? This is how we think as a functional medicine practitioner. And what we really get down to in the nitty-gritty of this is then going, okay, how can we then support the body as best we can to address this blood pressure using lifestyle intervention and more natural interventional strategies? So that could look like supplements, but we're going to start with the foundational pillars of health and really get these as solid as we can, which looks like sleep, which looks like exercise, which looks like mental and emotional health. It looks like community, and it looks like nutrition. Those are sort of the five main pillars of health. And we want those super, super, super solid, because it's not enough to do one rep of those one time a week. You need to be constantly doing reps of those every single day. And if we address those foundational pillars, we can address the majority of health issues that are cropping up in the modern world. And burnout falls into this category because burnout requires this holistic approach where we're looking at not just addressing the psychological components, which are really important, but also supporting the body. That's really, really, really critical. And I suppose this is one limitation of traditional psychology in terms of treating burnout, in that while they do a really good job of focusing on the emotional and mental symptoms, we need to be addressing that fatigue. We need to be looking at the body and what the body needs there. And we also need to be doing behavioral change. And so I like to think of functional medicine as providing us with a roadmap. And then the health coach comes in, and this is why I think the two work perfectly together, and which is why I combine the two for my clients, because then the health coach comes in and we walk with you on that journey. We provide support. We address any roadblocks with you real time. We're there with you real time to address them as they crop up. We help identify what's going to be the best way to get from A to B, because that journey will look different from different people. Because whilst there are a million things we could do to improve our health, what's the lowest hanging fruit for you that's going to give us the biggest bang for the buck? And that will look different depending on who you are, what you like, what you don't like, what you have access to, what you need, all these sorts of things. So, all this to say that the role of functional medicine is really, really helpful in terms of addressing the body piece. And a big part of functional medicine is doing diagnostic testing. And those diagnostic tests are really, 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 really useful. However, they're not as important as making sure that you're actually implementing the requisite lifestyle changes that are needed. So there are a number of tests that I refer for burnout. I refer for tests where I'm allowed to do that, which is here in Portugal, working with European clients basically, and also in Australia. And because I see people online, I work with a lot of people also from the US or from England, UK, elsewhere. And for those people, I co-manage a lot of the time with their family doctor, and their family doctor goes and does some of this testing, and then they see me for the health coaching, for actually help with implementing the changes they need, whether that be exercising more or figuring out what they need to do to improve their sleep or their nutrition, or renegotiating their relationship with work, or working on their perfectionism and their inability to ask for support from people, or working on boundary setting, or getting clear on what do they want professionally and personally from their life, all these sorts of things. But when we look from a functional medicine point of view at burnout, we're predominantly looking at fatigue, right? And fatigue can be caused by many things, which is why it's really important to take a proper medical history and to be working with someone who knows what questions to ask, because fatigue crops up in many ways and it can be due to many different systems of the body. The most common ones, I mean, anyone with a fatigue syndrome, even if they don't have burnout, but they have, for example, depression, and they have major depressive disorder, and fatigue is one of their main symptoms, I would always recommend just start with a full blood test, rule out any other red flags going on with the body so that we can then address the rest of what's going on here. Other things we often refer for are like saliva tests. Specifically there, we can look at cortisol profiles or adrenal function, also sex hormones and these sorts of things. And we can also look at sleep-wake cycles, so cortisol and melatonin. We can then also look at thyroid. Thyroid is a really, really big one that we're also often assessing for in terms of fatigue. And then vitamin deficiencies in terms of things like vitamin D, really, really common. Even in Australia, vitamin D deficiency is super common. B12 and folate, specifically amongst vegans and vegetarians, and also looking at the gut. The gut is a huge one. There, we're mainly looking at stool testing, but we can do other tests such as breath testing for SIBO, and those sorts of things as well. So I'm not going to talk around all of the different tests we would do as a functional medicine provider. I'm just going to pull out the most common ones. One of the most common ones we would be looking at is salivary testing, so saliva test. And it's really easy to do. Basically, you'll be sent 4 sample kits to your house to do over 12 hours. And you basically spit into a tube over 4 times over the day, and then you send that directly to the lab. Please don't send that to my house. That's out of my pay grade. And that goes to the lab, and then they basically map your cortisol levels. And often we will do also look at your sex hormones as well. So estrogen, testosterone, DHEAs, those sorts of things as well over the course of those 24 hours. Cortisol is one of our predominant stress hormones. Now, if you've been spending time in the healthscape, you've probably heard about this hormone because it's the one that gets elevated when we get activated into fight or flight response. It's what elevates our blood pressure, our heart rate. It elevates our blood glucose. It basically gets us ready to fight an animal or run away. And over a chronic time period, if it stays elevated, it can have detrimental effects on our health. However, it does get a bit of a bad rap because cortisol is completely natural. It helps us get out of bed in the morning. It's completely normal. You just need it at certain times of the day. And you don't want to be elevated, but you certainly don't want to be under either. And by the time a lot of people reach like clinical burnout stages, they're not actually producing enough cortisol. They've actually burnt through all their cortisol stores, and we need to basically let the adrenals recover to be able to produce more cortisol hormone. So as you can see, we map it over 24 hours and it's highest in the morning and then decreases in the day with a little bit of a spike in the afternoon. If you're in a state of chronic stress, it's just going to be elevated. If you're in a state of chronic fatigue, it will be elevated, normal in the morning, and then it will drop and it will stay low throughout the rest of the day. So it won't be able to endure through that full 24-hour cycle versus a burnout state where you've basically burnt through your cortisol stores and you're chronically low. You're actually not getting enough cortisol. And, this shows up differently in people's symptoms. Someone who's chronically stressed has the heart palpitations, the high blood pressure, they might be getting anxiety attacks, all these sorts of things. Keep doing that for long enough, and then you will develop a fatigue syndrome where you are exhausted all the time and you cannot get out of bed. And I wrote a piece a few years ago around why don't I feel stressed, but my body is stressed? Because we're not very good at, as a society, I've found we're not very good at actually knowing how stressed our body really is. We can feel fine, but our heart rate is up at 80, 90, way too high. Our blood pressure can be elevated. And we've just associated this as normal, but actually we're in a state of chronic stress, a chronically elevated cortisol. So go read that piece if you're interested, because it's something that you should be monitoring for yourself in terms of not only how do I feel, like what are my stress levels subjectively, but also what are my stress levels objectively, looking at things like heart rate and blood pressure and heart rate variability, which a lot of the Apple Watches and the sports watches and these things can do for you now, which is really great. Another test we commonly refer for is thyroid. And again, it's a really simple thing to do at home. If your thyroid comes back low, off you go. I send you to an endocrinologist, and we then have to co-manage you with an endocrinologist because you may need to take some hormone replacement therapy for your thyroid gland. Being low thyroid can show up with fatigue as one of its main symptoms, but also things like muscle pain, joint pain, brain fog, headaches, weight gain, so on and so forth. And that's out of my scope to treat. So we would send you to an endocrinologist at that stage and we would co-manage you. They would treat your thyroid and we would then look at how we can help you from a lifestyle intervention point of view. For example, thyroid function is really linked to minerals such as iodine, and iodine deficiency is a big risk factor for developing hypothyroidism, which means if you are low thyroid, basically doing little basic things like making sure your salt is iodized, you're using an iodized salt, you're eating enough seafood, so you're getting those sorts of salts there is really, really important. And for example, in Australia, we have really low iodine levels in our soil to the point where back in 2009, it's now Australian mandated law that any commercial bakery making bread that you would just buy off the shelves in the supermarket in Australia has all used iodized salt, like it's all supplemented with iodine, because what they were finding is that people in Australia were chronically low in iodine, which was predisposing them to things like low thyroid levels, which was predisposing them to fatigue states, burnout, all these sorts of things. Selenium is another good one. Look at things like Brazil nuts and sunflower seeds and seafood again there. Um, and then also exercise is another really big one here. Obviously, sleep as well, which I'll talk a little bit about later, but exercise is a really big one. And I think one of the conversations I commonly have with clients is the difference between fatigue and lethargy. Fatigue is a low energy state versus lethargy, which is a low motivation state. Now, you can have both. You can certainly have both, and a low motivation state can become a fatigue state, a low energy state. However, they're slightly different in terms of the effects on the body and how we would intervene. Someone with, for example, depression, who may be low dopamine and may have low motivation and these sorts of things, may feel really good after a high intensity HIIT class, like a high intensity exercise class. Because by going to doing that exercise class, you know, they've bumped up the dopamine, serotonin, and a bunch of other things, and they feel really re-energized. Someone with low energy, you put them in a high intensity exercise class, they may not be able to get out of bed for the next 3 days. And it's basically because they're low energy, and basically that is just burning them out even further. So, in cases of people with low thyroid function, low cortisol function, or they have a true fatigue syndrome going on, we generally recommend against high intensity exercise, and we're mainly focusing on aerobic exercise with proper breathing strategies, which I often teach my clients how to do, and also strength training. And strength training is really, really important for bone and joint health, particularly as we age, and we should be doing that multiple times a week. But generally, we're focusing on those strategies as opposed to a high intensity exercise, because even anyone who's had long COVID, or anyone with chronic fatigue syndrome, or anyone who has any of the spectrum of fatigue syndromes will know the challenge that can come from exercising and doing too much too quickly. And we have to be careful of this. Another test that we commonly look at that I refer for a lot, particularly if they have gastrointestinal symptoms alongside their fatigue symptoms, is stool testing. As I said, we can do other things to look at the GIT, such as breath tests, looking at SIBO specifically. But we can get a lot of information from a stool test. This report can go on for like 10, 11, 12 pages. I've only included 2 pages here. And it can be really, really specific and give us a lot of useful information. And in terms of, I had parasites, and that was a huge contributor to me developing fatigue. But also, what I saw, because my clinic started in a CrossFit box. And then, because of my background, I was working with a lot of athletes, both strength-based athletes, but also ultra endurance athletes, people doing like 100 milers, 100 kilometers, 50-kilometer runs, and these sorts of things. And they were really optimized in terms of movement, in terms of their training plans. They were working with the best coaches. They were doing all the recovery strategies. And yet they were still not recovering, or they were chronically getting injured, or they were chronically getting cold and flus. And what we found a lot of the time for these people is that they had things like gut dysbiosis, which means that your gut microbiome is not working as it should, or they had some sort of parasite and worm going on that needed to be looked at. Not always. Sometimes you can have parasites and they're asymptomatic and you don't need to treat them. But that's outside my scope again. If someone does have a parasite, I refer them on to one of the specialists that I work with, who can at least assess them and let us know whether they think it needs to be, if they need an anti-parasitic treatment. Because often you can be trying to do all the nutritional changes, taking all the pre and probiotics, but you may not be making any difference until you address that parasite first and foremost, and then you can rebuild and restore your gut health. As I said, they don't always need to be treated. And sometimes with the antiparasitic treatment, you're not fully eradicating them either. You're just weakening them, quote unquote, so that you can then grow more of the good bacteria within your gut. Our gut is like an ecosystem. It's like a rainforest, and we want to have a lot of diversity there, which is why nutritionally as well, we want to eat a diverse diet and a very rich plant-based diet as well. I tell my clients that I want them to eat 30 different plant-based foods a week, which does include grains, it includes fruits and vegetables as well. But we want them to having a lot of variety. We also want them eating a lot of fermented foods at least once a day, if not more. Um, because the fact of the matter is, our gut microbiome, the good bacteria in our gut, is going extinct as our environment goes extinct. And we are also eating antibiotics on a daily basis, even if we're not taking antibiotics. Antibiotics are essentially pesticides in pesticides, and a lot of the foods that we're eating, we're digesting these. Not to mention plastics and all sorts of things. Now, this sample report, this person is in a lot of trouble. They have blood here, they have mucus here, they have parasites and worms, they have very high inflammatory markers in their guts. So this isn't always the case, and it is really common to have gut dysbiosis. I've never seen someone who didn't have gut dysbiosis. So it's a work in progress. And again, it comes back to addressing the foundational pillars of health. And the foundational pillars of nutrition specifically is looking at things like eating a whole grain rich diet, eating a lot of fruit and veg, making sure you're getting enough fiber. And short chain fatty acids is one that we look at, this top one here, a lot in terms of fatigue syndromes, because short chain fatty acids are basically what our gut microbiome breaks down from fiber, which is why fiber is really important. And these are really neuroprotective. Keep in mind, not only is 50% of dopamine produced in the gut, 90% of serotonin is produced in the gut, serotonin being your happy hormone, also really important for energy. But also, these short chain fatty acids are really neuroprotective. They can cross the blood-brain barrier. They help prevent mental health disorders. They help prevent inflammation of the brain. They help prevent leaky gut, intestinal permeability. They help prevent things like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's and brain fog and so on and so on. So that's really, really important there. Unfortunately, this is where can become more challenging when you're working with someone with IBS, because a lot of the fiber-rich foods are the plant foods that are also they're sensitive to and triggering their IBS symptoms. So this is where a bit more of a specific person-centered approach becomes really, really important. We can also see here indicators of a leaky gut or intestinal permeability, such as the calprotectin, the secretory IgA, the zonulin, those sorts of things, which again would set up for someone a fatigue syndrome and also set up for them mental health disorders as well. So now that we have done the testing and we know what might be going on, what do we do about it? And this is probably the most important part, I suppose. As I said, it's not crucial to have functional medicine testing done for a majority of people with burnout. A lot of people have quite good awareness of where their burnout is coming from. And yet, particularly given if they have physical symptoms, it is a very good idea to have a look at the body so we can help support the body as best we can in a very specific way. But what do we do with that? Well, there are a number of ways we can address physical well-being and restore physical health from burnout. So basically restore the body, a burnt out body. And I've broadly categorized them into hormonal, nutritional, and nervous system support. Hormonal support meaning how do we re-regulate hormones such as cortisols, other stress hormones, sex hormones, these sorts of things. And the first big components of hormonal support comes from nutritional support and nervous system support. And lumped into nervous system support is sleep, of course, and also movement. Another big way we need to support hormones is, ensuring we're getting the right fluid and salt intake, because if we are in a state of burnout, we're basically in a state of really bad dehydration, cellular dehydration, and we need to address that. Hormone replacement therapy might be required. That can look like not only like estrogen or testosterone replacements, but also things like we actually sometimes may need to replace people's cortisone. And there are ways that we can do this, particularly in the early days, whilst we're sort of restoring their adrenal health. Then there are other specific supplements. Common ones include melatonin for sleep, vitamin D, vitamin C, fiber and prebiotics, adrenal support supplements, and pancreatic enzymes, all really, really important. From a nutritional point of view, one I'd say of the major things that I look for and address is food timing because the majority of people with burnouts are not eating well. A lot of the time they're under eating and they're skipping meals, and this puts them in a fasted state. But what you need to know is that when you're in a fasted state, that elevates your cortisol. So it actually will burn you out even more quickly. So food timing is really important. Making sure you're actually not skipping meals is really, really important. Making sure you're eating a balanced diet, of course, is really, really important. And whilst fasting can have really good effects on our health, it needs to be done in a controlled manner at the right times. Food timing also includes making sure you're not having a huge meal right before bed, and that after your main meal, if you can do something like move your body, that will actually help manage your blood glucose levels for people where that's an issue. And that can also really help with fatigue. As with a lot of mental health issues, Mediterranean diet is recommended. But Mediterranean diet doesn't mean pizza and pasta, which some of my clients seem to think that it does. The Mediterranean diet means whole foods. It's a plant-rich diet. There's a lot of grains, there's a lot of veggies, there's fruits. It's very, very high fiber for those short-chain fatty acids I spoke about before. It's also moderately consumptive of fish and chicken and eggs and these sorts of things. And it's high omega-3. And omega-3 is a really important anti-inflammatory. It's really important for brain and heart health. And it also helps regulate our cortisol levels in the body as well. We then need to be reducing the bad foods. No surprises there. I'm not going to spend too much time in that. That's kind of self-explanatory. But basically, just there's a bit of a myth maybe that I just want to dispel is that people think of the bad foods as just empty calories, quote unquote, but they're not. They're pro-inflammatory. You're basically putting your body into a state of inflammation, which is making it harder to heal. They're not empty calories. They're actually damaging calories. So a good diet is as much what you eat as much as you don't eat, and reducing these artificial foods, reducing processed foods and refined sugars and saturated fats is really important. As with that, of course, caffeine, alcohol, and smoking, all really, really important as well. And then fiber, prebiotics, and vitamin D supplements again. Now, in terms of nervous system support, sleep is a huge one, and we have such a complex relationship with sleep and rest. We are really bad at it societally. But what I notice for myself, and it's taken me a while to kind of unhook this, and I still feel like I'm having to prove it to myself, is that when I sleep and rest, the more I rest, actually, the more productive I am, even though I may be doing less in terms of quantity of hours in front of the computer, I'm more productive by the end of the day. And yet I've done less. Naps are another really huge one. Many societies have naps built into the culture. We've sort of built that out of the culture, which is quite unique in terms of the broader history of humanity. And naps can be really, 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 really helpful. Your body is really wise. If it's telling you to rest, it probably needs rest. Chances are you're not going to want to stay there forever, particularly if it is a burnout syndrome. You're just going to need some rest, and then you're probably a high achiever. You're probably going to want to get up and do something else. And it's actually more allowing ourselves, giving us permission to rest that I find to be an issue with people with burnout than the other way, than resting too much. Um, I talk a lot about breathing with clients. Specifically, I teach them how to breathe because breathing is the main place we get energy. And we think of food as being the place we get energy, but it's not. You know, you can survive like 2 weeks without eating. You can survive a few days without water, but you can only survive a few minutes without breathing. And we have two main ways that we create energy in the body through the breath: aerobic breathing and anaerobic breathing. Now, when we're aerobically breathing, it means that we're breathing good quality breathing through the diaphragm, exhaling longer than we're inhaling a lot of the time. It's a comfortable at rest breath. Hopefully, it's in and out through the nose, and it means that we're not overworking. It's a very calm breath. And what this means is that in terms of the way that it produces energy in the body, for every molecule of glucose, you produce 36 molecules of energy, which is known as ATP, adenosine triphosphate. I think I always forget that word, but ATP, you produce 36 molecules of that, which is then used by the body for energy. Now, if you're in a state of overbreathing or you're chest breathing, you're breathing really rapidly, you're not breathing well, you are basically in a state of overbreathing and you're working hard. And if you're doing that at a state of rest, you really don't need to be. And you're only producing for every molecule of glucose, 2 molecules of energy. And you are also creating the byproduct lactic acid, which then makes the body have to work even harder because all of a sudden it has to move this toxin. And lactic acid can contribute to muscle soreness and muscle fatigue and all these sorts of things. And it's quite amazing how many clients I've had with chronic fatigue syndrome or fibromyalgia or long COVID or some sort of fatigue syndrome where just by improving their breathing, their widespread muscle pain went from about a 7 or an 8 out of 10 down to a 2. So super, super important. That ties in with exercise. By aerobic exercise, we're talking around good quality exercise that uses this breathing strategy, where you're aerobically breathing. And strength-based exercise, I already spoke about the caution with high intensity exercise. Psychological and relational support, super critically important, whether that includes me, but it also includes family, it includes friends. It should include the employer as well. Hopefully your workplace isn't that toxic. You can't have a conversation with them about it because they do also have responsibilities as well, to you. And finally, mindfulness exercises. There's a lot of growing research supporting the use of mindfulness exercises for specifically putting us into a parasympathetic state, which is really helpful for people with burnout. So this is the first sort of 3 weeks. So this is sort of where the functional medicine component ties in, how we sort of work with addressing out the body, level of the body, figuring out what we need to individualize to make that work for that person's specific symptom presentation, and also what they can achieve in the time that they have available to them. From there, of course, we need to also look at the emotional aspects of burnout. We need to look at the mental and the relational aspects of burnout. We also need to look at the spiritual aspects of burnout. You know, burnout is also a crisis of meaning. It's a crisis of identity. It can call into question existential questions around mortality, particularly once we lose our energy. We're really faced with our own mortality there. It can call into questions around identity and sense of self. It can compromise like financial health, relationships. There is a strong component of people grappling a disillusionment through their burnout journey. You know, something's not as they had thought it would be. Something's not measuring up to their expectations in terms of either their work life or in terms of what they thought their body was capable of. And with that, there's often a grieving process too. Like part of my job as a health coach is also not only getting people back on track and helping them move towards what they want, but also helping them grieve what wasn't or what isn't and what wasn't the right fit. And part of that is really, really critically important for helping them move on and recover from burnouts. But that's a whole huge topic, and we don't have time for that today. So I'm doing another webinar in 2 weeks where we'll just dive in and we'll look specifically at the mind and the soul. If today was about the body, in 2 weeks, we'll look at the mind and the soul or the spirits, whatever you want to call it, at these levels and how we work with burnout at the emotional, mental, or relational level from an evidence-based perspective. And then I'm going to do one the following week on the workplace because, again, we need more time to look at the workplace. What does a successful career look like for you? How do we address burnout at the individual level? How do we address it at the organizational level? All these sorts of things. We need a whole lot of time to just look at that and deep dive into that. So we'll do a webinar on that in 3 weeks' time, separate webinar on that too. And that will be aimed at both employees, but also employers, including HR professionals. So if there's anyone you'd like to bring along to that, bring them along, bring a work colleague, tell your boss to come along to that too, because it's all part of preventing burnout. The more people who are cognizant of it, the more we can build healthier work environments that prevent burnout from occurring. Ooh, okay, that was a lot. I'm now going to open it up to questions, see what you have for me. If you would like to sign that QR code now, book in a free 15-minute call with me, and let's have a chat around what is going on with your burnout specifically. If I'm not the right person to help you, I will definitely try and point you in the direction of someone who I think can. But let's have a chat. Let's see if we're the right fit for one another, and let's start you on that journey back to recovery because the longer you wait, the harder it's going to be. And you're never going to be more resourced than you are now to address this thing. So let's do it. Let's have a chat. And now let's open it up to questions. Oh, one more thing I'll say on that. That will take you to my calendar link. Obviously, I live in Portugal. So I'm on wet GMT time. If you don't see any times there that work for you, send me an email, jump on my website, and there's a contact page there. Send me an email with some times that work for you, and let's figure out a time that works that is outside those hours. And I'm very, very happy to do that. I have a bit more flexibility than what I've put there in my calendar. And now let's open it up to questions.